Welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Puzzle. Today, my guest is Professor Michael Woldemariam. Professor Woldemariam is an associate professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a senior fellow at the Maryland Center for International and Security Studies. Professor Woldemariam focuses on teaching and research in Africa's security studies, with special attention to armed conflicts in the Horn of Africa. In this episode, we discuss the crisis in the Horn of Africa due to the civil war between the government of Ethiopia and the insurgents of the Tigray region. Professor Woldemariam, how are you?
I'm doing well.
I am so happy to have you for this episode number 4. We will discuss an interesting topic about the conflict in Ethiopia and that takes place in the Tigray region in the Horn of Africa. Professor, but first of all, to understand the Horn of Africa region and start this conversation, I would like to ask you, what countries make this strategic peninsula in the African continent, and what natural resources is this region rich in?
Again, Juan Carlos, it's a pleasure to join you. I hope this will be an interesting and important conversation. In terms of the definition of the Horn of Africa, or what countries fall into this particular region, interestingly, there is some debate, discussions, or differences of opinion about what countries to include in the Horn of Africa. Certainly, if we look at countries that are spatially, geographically central to the region, I think you would place Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, and then the de facto Republic of Somaliland. I think most would agree, because of geographically where these countries sit, that they are in fact part of the Horn of Africa. And then you have other countries that sit spatially, geographically on the peripheries of the region: Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, that many would consider to also be part of the Horn of Africa region. As someone who's followed the Horn for some time, for instance, I find it very difficult to imagine the Horn of Africa without Sudan, for instance, right? It's been politically quite relevant and engaged in the Horn of Africa region. Now, if we were to look at the Horn of Africa or define it by its regional organization, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, again, the region's main multilateral entity, then we would also need to include Uganda. I think of Uganda as relevant, but less so than some of these other countries to the Horn of Africa, particularly those that sit on the periphery of the region.
I see. Professor, and in terms of natural resources, what is the main natural resources they have? Petroleum, oil, gas, agriculture, I know is very important.
The short answer is it depends which country in the region you're talking about. They have different natural resource endowments. This is not overall, historically, never been a region that has produced sort of high value natural resources. This is not the DRC or Central Africa. But there are a number of countries that do have high value natural resources. South Sudan, for instance, its main export is oil. Sudan, when it was united with the South, was a big oil exporter, and now it primarily exports gold, one of the main producers of gold in the African continent. Other countries around the region produce. A country like Eritrea, for instance, has mines, produces a bit of copper and zinc. They have a growing potash sector. Ethiopia has been a big coffee producer historically. If we go to the Somali-speaking regions of Ethiopia, a lot of what they export is in the livestock sector, and some other items as well. So it varies.
I see. Well, I read, yes, the livestock is so important in this area as well. Professor, the countries of the Horn of Africa are closely related, as you just mentioned, just you just explained a little bit, but not only by their geography, it's also their history and demography. So let's talk about geopolitics. Geopolitically speaking, why is this region important in Africa? I read that, for example, it's very important in terms of trade, because we have the Suez Canal, we have, the Red Sea, etc. Would you mind elaborate a little bit why is this region is important in Africa?
So I think there are two ways to take up this question. The first way is to simply look at the size of some of these states. They're quite big, both in geographic terms, not all of them in geographic terms, but many of them in geographic terms, but also in terms of their population, right? So So Ethiopia, for example, is after Nigeria, the second most populous state on the African continent. Right now, we think somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 million people. It is also, this is a different issue, the seat of the African Union, right? The Africa's main multilateral organization. So that also gives it, historically, has provided it quite a bit of diplomatic heft. But if we look at countries like Uganda, if we look at countries like Sudan, if we look at countries like Kenya, these are all states in terms of population rank in the top 10 of the African continent, right? So that, I think that is significant. Sudan, before South Sudan split, was geographically, I mean, in terms of size, landmass, the largest country on the African continent, right? I mean, absolutely sprawling. So there is just the size of these countries, and I would also add, if you've been following the news recently, Ethiopia was recently included or invited to join the BRICS, and I think one of the reasons is, and there were several, but I think one of the reasons is simply the size of the country, and by extension the virtue, or rather the economic potential of that particular country. Now there's also a question of maritime straits. And I think this is quite central to understanding why the Horn of Africa has been geopolitically relevant to a number of extra-regional powers. So the Horn of Africa sits astride the Red Sea corridor, includes the Suez Canal, the Bab el Mandab, and then feeds into the Gulf of Aden and the Western Indian Ocean. And this is a critical strait for trade between Europe and Asia. Right, so almost 90% of trade, maritime trade between Europe and Asia, goes through the Red Sea and off the coast of the Horn of Africa. And it's also, I would add, the corridor is very vulnerable to interruptions of maritime traffic because of these strategic straits, right? Both the Suez and the Bab el Mandab. So I think, and I would also add, it's the importance of the maritime corridor is not just in terms of economics. It's also in terms of military strategy. So for Western military planners that want to be able to project power into the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific, particularly maritime power, they need to think about how solid access is through the Red Sea. So again, for that reason, countries are a real focus of geopolitical attention by a number of outside powers. During the Cold War, it was the United States, the Soviets, and indeed some of the Western European countries as well. Now it's China, Russia to some extent, the United States, the Gulf countries. And it's one of the reasons that at this point, there are a number of countries that have or are seeking to establish military outposts in the Red Sea Basin.
Thank you for this answer. These answers will help me to get into the and move on to the next part of this conversation, Professor. The Horn of Africa is also one of the world's most conflict-affected regions in the world. Every country in the Horn of Africa has experienced political conflicts for decades, and one of them is the conflict that we're having right now in Ethiopia. Right? Let's dig a little bit in the current conflict or civil war between Ethiopian government and the Tigray region. Since that wasn't between 2022, but it seems that the conflict is still happening. Professor, briefly, how this conflict start? I read something that is was related to the assumption of the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and also what the Tigrayans are looking for.
Sure. So before I answer that question, let me just say up front that the conflict landscape across the Horn of Africa is quite complicated at the moment. Right, there are a number of active conflicts. The crisis in Sudan, which has already displaced millions, the ongoing conflict in Somalia, right, that is taking, I think, some interesting turns. And then when we look at Ethiopia, I mean, the Tigray question is not the only, or the Tigray issue is not the only sort of conflict that we are seeing in Ethiopia. In fact, in recent months, the violence in Tigray has subsided because there's been a peace agreement being implemented. We could talk more about that. And there are other parts of the country that are, to be frank, on fire, right? In the Amhara region or Oromia region, these are Ethiopia's two largest demographic, two regions that have the largest populations, right? So I want to preface my comments with that. But in terms of the origins of the Tigray conflict, I mean, as is always the case with these kinds of things, there is this question about where do we begin? Where do we start the origin story? I think the easiest way to do this is to begin with a leadership transition in Ethiopia in 2018 and the rise of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia. between 1991 and 2018, the country is ruled by a coalition of parties called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. It was an organization that had some achievements in the development space, but I think ruled in a fairly authoritarian manner during its tenure. But at the center, at the apex of this ruling coalition, was the aforementioned TPLF, right, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. There were four ethnic parties. Ethiopia was and is an ethnic federal system, and the TPLF, representing the Tigray region, was really at the apex of this ruling coalition, and controlled key aspects of the Ethiopian state. The bureaucracy, the security apparatus, controlled the commanding heights of the economy, etc. Abiy comes to power over and above the objections of the TPLF, and we could talk about the kind of the jockeying that was associated with Abiy's rise to power. There was a lot of inter-party conflict at the time, right? Much of it driven by protests and instability across wide swaths of the country. But Abiy's rise represented, because the TPLF had opposed it, represented dilution, diminution, erosion of TPLF standing within the ruling coalition and its control of the Ethiopian state more broadly. And because Abiy himself was, of course, interested in consolidating power, and the TPLF was interested in preserving what they had, the two entities, the two actors, were on a collision course from the very beginning. And so over a period of 2 years, through kind of tit-for-tat process, the tensions escalate and explode into violence in November of 2020, right? And there were a number of kind of key inflection points. There was a dispute over the timing of national elections. There was a dispute over the elimination of the old ruling party and the creation of a new party called the Prosperity Party, which was more directly under the control of the prime minister. The TPLF, of course, opposed this. So that's, I think, one part of the story. There are, of course, other actors involved in the kind of post or the sort of that are involved in the aftermath of Abiy's rise and kind of the escalation of hostilities at the national level. There are a number of actors in the Amhara region, in the region of Oromia that are jockeying for power, right, and trying to cultivate political bases and really carve out a political role for themselves. And many of them, at times, some of these groups are co-opted by the prime minister, but at certain junctures, they confront him and are locked in political struggle with him. And so that these other actors are also kind of fueling the escalation of hostilities or tensions in various ways. Indeed, when the Tigray War breaks out, over this actually emerges after probably a year into the war. There are a number of other groups that strike up a tactical coalition, or rather maybe a strategic coalition with the TPLF. So a group like the Oromo Liberation Army that strikes up a coalition with the TPLF against the federal government. At the same time, from the beginning of the war, the outbreak of the war in November in 2020, political forces in the Amhara region, who have their own disputes with the Tigrayan side, militarily backed the Abiy's government, right? So, this is a long way of saying the crisis that breaks out in Ethiopia in November 2020 and is ongoing is not simply a two-player game. There were other actors involved.
Another kind of fronts.
Exactly.
And play all the time.
Absolutely. And not all military actors, civilian actors, political parties as well, that found themselves on various sides of the political divide.
Professor, it's true that TPLF, the movement TPLF, dominated politics in the country since 1991?
I mean, I think that is accurate. I mean, the ruling party was a coalition of four parties.
Oh, I see.
There certainly were in those other parties influential voices. They were able at certain junctures to exert influence on national policy, on policies within their own particular ethnic regions. But at the end of the day, in this period, I think the TPLF was the central player, right, in the ruling party and in national politics. Now, part of the reason for that is that the ruling coalition comes to power in 1991 through a military victory over the old communist government called the Derg, right, led by Mengistu Hailemariam. And militarily, the strongest element of the ruling party, which was then a rebel movement that toppled the Derg, was the TPLF. right? So what they effectively do in the 1990s is translate their military preeminence as a rebel front into their political preeminence as, the sort of leading players in governing the Ethiopian state.
Professor, there is a third player in this conflict, and it's Eritrea, right? So Ethiopia and Eritrea had a huge war years ago. However, they are allies, against the insurgents in the Tigray region. Correct? What is the role of Eritrea? What I read during my research about this conflict, try to understand the role of Eritrea in the conflict. And then some internet portals say that Asmara want to reassert itself in the region. What is your opinion? What is the role of Eritrea as a former, rival or enemy of Ethiopia?
It's a good question. You're right. Eritrea was a key player in this particular conflict. It intervened on the side of the Ethiopian government and the Amhara political forces at the very beginning of the war. And the reason they do this is because they have their own long and tortured history with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Right? So when the TPLF, and keep in mind, Tigray borders
Yes,
Eritrea.
it is border Eritrea.
Right, so I think that's a critical
Very
piece
northern.
of this. Exactly. And so when the TPLF is at the center of the Ethiopian state in 1998, Ethiopia goes to war with Eritrea primarily over differences over the border, the mutual border, and economic issues. Now keep in mind, Eritrea had been part of Ethiopia up until 1991, and Eritrea's separation from Ethiopia raised all of these difficult questions, right, about where the borders lay, about the proper and appropriate economic relations between these two newly separated states, right? And that leads to a clash in 1998. And because the TPLF was running the Ethiopian state to a large extent, the view of the Eritrean side, or the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, Eritrea's ruling party, was really that their beef and their rivalry was with the TPLF, right? So when the TPLF is then ousted, or I should say its power at the national level in Ethiopia is diminished in 2018, the Eritrean government tries to guarantee or ensure that the TPLF is permanently removed from the national stage in Ethiopia by backing Prime Minister Abiy and making common cause with him. So they were in political and security alliance well before the outbreak of the war. When the war breaks out, of course, it was a foregone conclusion that they would seek to support Abiy. Now understand, from the Eritrean perspective, it's not simply a question of kind of old grievances related to the border war. The Eritrean side also judged the TPLF to be a security threat to Eritrea. And again, these are bordering lands and territories. And I think the concern was not so much that the TPLF was a symmetric threat, but that through various forms of subterfuge might seek to undermine the Eritrean state and destabilize its government. Also understand Eritrea has its own very authoritarian political settlement, and the government naturally worries about its stability and external influences in that regard. It's a long answer to your question, but hopefully it provides a solid picture of why Eritrea intervened. I would just add one more thing, and this is something that you briefly kind of touched on. I think there is a way in which the Eritrean government saw its presence in Ethiopia, its involvement in that war as a mechanism or way of boosting their own regional influence, right? Because if you have influence in Ethiopia, the region's largest state, diplomatically its most significant, then you have broader regional influence.
Oh, certainly. Interesting answer, Professor. So, the conflict itself, the Ethiopian-Tigray region conflict, has many situations that happen simultaneously. Like, for example, human rights violations, war crimes, hunger, the displaced that we talked, early in this conversation, and economic impacts, of course, like billions of millions of dollars in damage in infrastructure, productivity losses, and like in affecting the GDP and the country, etc. But let's talk about a critical challenge, which is the peace process. We have plenty, but very important is the peace process. Is there any process or disarmament or agreement between the parties involved in this conflict? Or, for example, or an expert like yourself, they call DDR, process which stands with disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Is there any process?
I would just, before I answer the question, would refer back to your comments on the brutality of the war. I think that absolutely needs to be underscored. Over the course of 2 years, we think somewhere over 500,000 people were killed. There was millions of people displaced. Sexual violence was deployed. I mean, a whole array of atrocities. And Tigray, I think, bore the biggest brunt of the conflict in terms of human cost, but other regions of Ethiopia did as well because it spilled over into adjoining regions. So again, absolutely horrific, I think, conflict in terms of its human toll. And indeed, one challenge of moving forward, I think, for Ethiopia more generally is addressing the kind of human toll and human fallout of the conflict. I think one positive development has been that a cessation of hostilities agreement was signed in November 2022 between Ethiopia's federal government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So at this juncture, hostilities between the federal government and the Tigrayan side have effectively ceased. The nature of this agreement, and we could have a long conversation about what actually contributed to the reaching of an agreement. There were shifts in military dynamics that preceded the cessation of hostilities in November 2022 that are worth considering and talking about. But the nature of the exact essence of the agreement is essentially this, and I'm simplifying in a lot of ways. The Tigrayan side and the TPLF agreed to full DDR for its aligned forces, and particularly in a force called the Tigray Defense Forces. And in return, the federal government would re-legalize and politically normalize the TPLF. Because one thing you should know is that at the beginning of the war, the Ethiopian government basically designates the TPLF as a terrorist organization, right? And so after the cessation of hostilities, Ethiopian parliament removes that designation. So there's a renormalization, relegalization, political normalization, and relegalization of the TPLF. And I think, as it's played out, a recognition of the TPLF's status as sort of the regional government of Tigray, right? So Tigray has, at this moment, interim regional administration, and it is for all intents and purposes sort of dominated by the TPLF. So again, simplifying, but that's the nature of the deal, right? DDR and sort of the Tigrayan side putting down their weapons and their guns and recognizing Prime Minister Abiy's legitimacy in return for their political normalization, re-entry into the Ethiopian political sphere. Now, I think one major challenge with the agreement, I'll just put this on the table and refer back to you, is that this was a multi-sided civil war. But the peace agreement is really only between two actors, right? The TPLF and the federal government, Prime Minister Abiy's government. But particularly on the Ethiopian side, fighting with the federal government, you had the Eritrean government and you had a variety of Amhara armed forces who are not, certainly don't feel as if they were represented at the negotiating table and may not have even wanted to be at the negotiating table. And I think tensions between the Tigrayan leadership and political authorities in Eritrea and the Amhara region persist.
In this process, of course, we have another kind of stakeholders, right? What are the reaction of the countries around, like the Djibouti, Sudan, the African Union, which is an important entity in the continent, the United States, even China? Because what I read is that China recently launched, they call the Initiative of Peaceful Development in the Horn of Africa, and appointed actually its first special envoy for the region. So what are your thoughts about that?
Let's take this sort of external actor by external actor. So, in reference to the peace agreement that I mentioned a moment ago, I mean, the African Union was the mechanism or was the actor that was responsible, at least at a formal level, for helping to mediate the end or that cessation of hostilities agreement, right? So, former President of Nigeria, Obasanjo, was the AU representative that led, at least formally led negotiations, supported by former President of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, and a former Deputy President of South Africa. So that was the AU. So the AU played a key role. But it must be said, for much of the conflict, the AU, and particularly the AU Commission, was really sort of missing in action when it came to trying to find a resolution to the Tigray conflict and the war in northern Ethiopia. That's probably the better way to refer to it because it spilled over into adjoining regions. And I think that the AU, remember, the AU is based in Addis Ababa. And this has been the case for decades. I mean, the AU bureaucracy is subject to quite a bit of influence from Ethiopian leaders. And so when the Ethiopian government was not really interested in negotiations or a political track to end the conflict, the AU pretty much ignored the conflict, right? Demonstrated deference or exhibited deference to the Ethiopian state. When by early 2022, the Ethiopian government begins to indicate it's interested, alongside the Tigrayans and inside the TPLF, in some sort of political settlement, then the AU begins to move begins to sort of put forward or construct a process through a lot of forward steps and backward movement. It was a lot. It was a very haphazard process. So that's the AU. If we look at the United States, I mean, the Trump administration, I think, because the war breaks out, this is interesting, and perhaps there are connections we could talk through. But the war breaks out on election eve in the United States, right? Trump versus Biden. It was November 3rd or November 4th, 2020. In this period between November and when the Trump administration exits, the Trump administration mostly has a kind of a pro-Abiy kind of approach to the conflict, right? Which is more or less to kind of back his desire to resolve the conflict militarily, right? And I think in the early phase of the war, I think Abiy, alongside his allies, had the upper hand. The Biden administration takes a different approach when they come in early 2021, and they try and very aggressively push a political solution to the conflict, right? Talks effectively between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, and they also insist on a number of other things like open, humanitarian access, kind of unhindered humanitarian access, and an end to human rights abuses. That diplomatic posture puts the United States, the Biden administration, at loggerheads with the Ethiopian government, right, which is still at that juncture of the war seeking a military solution. And relations between Prime Minister Abiy's government and the United States, I think, really deteriorate from that point onwards. Once Abiy is willing to entertain a political solution to the conflict, talks, and the Tigrayans get to that point as well, then you begin to see kind of U.S.-Ethiopia ties, I wouldn't say rehabilitated, but things get a bit better. And indeed, the United States is a real catalyst, a really critical player, I think, in pushing forward the AU process, right? It's in the background through a U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa and pushing that process forward. So that's the United States. Neighboring countries, well, actually, let's go to China. China plays an interesting role. I mean,
it's everywhere.
Yes. I mean, of course, China, as I understand it, I think it's still the case, is Ethiopia's major trade partner. If that's not the case right now, it was certainly the case in years prior, and is deeply, through infrastructure development, investment, trade relations, sort of deeply bound up in the Ethiopian economy. Some of Ethiopia's development successes in the 2000s and 2010s were really tied to sort of the Chinese push in Ethiopia. China, despite its relations, sort of close relations with the previous regime in Ethiopia, right, the EPRDF dominated by the TPLF, really tries to avoid getting in any way involved in the Ethiopian conflict. They express at various junctures concern, but are not activist in the way the United States is in trying to forge a political solution. And in fact, when there are efforts, mostly by Western countries, to put Ethiopia on the UN Security Council agenda, which is something the Ethiopian government did not want, China joins with Russia to basically block those efforts, really thwart any kind of multilateral approach to the Ethiopia conflict. Now, yes, you're right. They did deploy a special envoy and have a conference, but there was no, in my view, there was no real political substance to it, right, in terms of trying to drive conflict resolution, in my view. The neighboring countries, I think, were worried by the conflict to varying degrees, almost all of them. Djibouti has its own tension and rivalry with Eritrea and was very uncomfortable with Eritrea's role in the Ethiopian conflict, which they saw as an expansion of its influence, and of course worried about instability in Ethiopia more generally, because the Djiboutian economy is very much tied up with Ethiopia, right? Djibouti
is a smaller country as well.
Yes, yeah, Djibouti is the outlet for, over 95% of Ethiopian goods and services. In terms of ports, right?
It's true.
Sudan also has its own, the military in Sudan, which was ascendant at the time, has its own problems with the Eritrean government, worried about its intervention in Ethiopia, but also critically had its own tensions with Ethiopia over particularly a disputed piece of territory called the Al-Fashaga Triangle, and also the Nile waters, which brings Egypt into the picture as well. And there are reports, which I think are credible, that the Sudanese provided some support, not particularly significant, but some support to the Tigrayan side, right? In terms of allowing them to organize within Sudanese borders, and possibly in terms of some weapon shipments and so on. So now the Sudanese also border Ethiopia, and they were worried about the humanitarian fallout of the conflict, right? There were a number of Tigrayan refugees, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60, 70,000 that crossed the border early in the war. So they had also that humanitarian challenge. So I think that's how I think I've gone through actor by actor, but I think that's sort of how they related to the conflict.
No, that's great, Professor. I really appreciate, because it's the only way to really understand what's going on in the conflict.
Could I say one more thing,
Oh,
Juan
please,
Carlos,
please.
and because I think there are some other external actors that were quite relevant to the conflict that we haven't discussed. So, in particular, the UAE, which at various junctures in the conflict backed Abiy's government through military equipment, through drone support. Turkey also sold drones to the Ethiopian government. So I think those two actors were key, particularly the Emiratis, who really leaned in militarily into this conflict. I think the Egyptians, we don't know. I mean, it's a bit murky about the Egyptian role and the extent to which they might have tried to support the TPLF, but it's possible they were relevant at the margins via Sudan. But they were that connection was always tenuous, because early on in the war, the land corridor between Tigray and Sudan is cut by the Ethiopian government and its allies, right? So,
Certainly, this region is a very challenging region from all the actors around. Professor, before wrapping up, I would like to ask you about your book. You wrote a book in 2018, Insurgent Fragmentation in the Horn of Africa, Rebellion and its Discontents. So what inspired you to write this book, Professor?
yeah, I mean, this was a text that was a book, rather, that was published in 2018. It's my first book. I don't think it will be my last.
Oh, I bet no.
But it was my first foray into book writing, and it looks at the dynamic of insurgent fragmentation, rebel fragmentation, splits and divisions within armed groups, which is, I think, an important dynamic in contemporary civil wars, because it can lead to an escalation of violence. It can make getting to a peace agreement particularly difficult when you have divided rebel fronts. It can shape the ultimate outcome of particular conflicts: who wins, who loses, and so on. So it's substantively an important question. But in engaging on that issue, that theoretical thematic question, I do it in the context of the Horn of Africa. So my case studies are drawn from Eritrea's very long war of liberation, some conflicts in Ethiopia. I have a chapter on Somalia civil wars. So the Horn of Africa is kind of the ground in which I investigate these broader theoretical issues. And I make the argument in the end that we can really understand, in order to understand the fragmentation of armed groups, we have to look at military dynamics, right? And how battlefield dynamics impact the cohesion of these particular groups.
Professor Woldemariam, is there anything that you would like to add to this conversation before wrapping up? And also where people can contact you?
Yep. Juan Carlos, I would just conclude by thanking you for the invitation to participate. If folks want to get in touch with me, they can Google me, find my faculty email address, and always happy to be in touch.
Perfect. Professor Woldemariam, I would like to say thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. Thank you so much, everyone.